Jesus gave his life a ransom yonder on Calvary. On Mount Calvary, cruel Calvary, paved the way by blood that we might win a bright shining crown. Praise his lovely name. Salvation has been brought down, oh glory.
I'd like to welcome you to the Florida School of Preaching Harvester Podcast. We are glad that you are joining us this morning. This is what I'm going to call a Bumper-Sowed number 1, and that is between our first and second seasons. We're going to have these 2 episodes. We're going to talk about leadership. I am your host, Brian Kenyon, along with the host,
Steven Ford.
And we're both with the South Florida Avenue Church of Christ, but also with the Florida School of Preaching. And so leadership is something, Stephen, that we need to always work on for the local church. And really, any business, anything that we are involved in, any organization is going to have leadership, the church included. And, a lot of times when we think of leadership in the church, we automatically think of elders or elderships or shepherds. And though that is probably the highest form of leadership in a local congregation, I heard Tom Holland one time preach on our lectureship several years ago, and I couldn't find the exact wording of it, but it's something to the effect of, to whatever extent a Christian influences others to live for Jesus, to that extent he or she is a Christian leader. And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
I think that's a good working definition. I kind of was thinking the same thing. I wanted to try to see if we could define that first before we got really into the weeds of it. Because leadership, I think, to many people can mean multiple things depending on who you're asking. And for the sake of this conversation, what the Bible demonstrates, I think that's a good definition. I was thinking one's ability to motivate and influence others. Also want to kind of work in demonstrating some, good and godly behaviors in there some kind of way. But that Tom Holland's definition sounds like a good working definition.
Yes, and I also came across a quote by a man by the name of John Maxwell, and he is a leadership guru guy, I guess, in the secular world, does a lot of seminars and stuff, but he mentioned this, quote, "The single biggest way to impact an organization is to focus on leadership development. There is almost no limit to the potential of an organization that recruits good people, raises them up as leaders, and continually develops them." And he is mentioning that from a secular background, but I think that those principles hold true with the church.
Absolutely. You even see it demonstrated in both the Old and the New Testament, especially with the church. Well, I won't say especially, but specifically in the church, you find that leadership model of developing leaders, which is something I think is characteristic of a leader, that you develop other leaders.
Yes, and that's a very good point. I know a congregation kind of locally to here who had 3 elders, and 2 of them died within a month of each other. And so they had another guy waiting in the wings, and they did appoint him as an elder, so it saved the eldership. But even he would tell you he may not have been as ready as he could have been. But it's like, churches must constantly, local churches of Christ must constantly look to the future and constantly train men to be in the place of leaders. And, of course, how they get to that point is to, have this culture of, next man up, as it were. If something goes wrong with someone or something that when you step in, you're needed. And we see that in Old Testament examples. For example, Joshua, we'll take a look at Joshua here in a minute, but just the importance of having men or people ready in whatever leadership capacity is involved in a local church, even sometimes with the ladies, and there's certain aspects that God gives them authority to lead in, people need to be ready.
Yeah, when I worked for a long time in management for Radio Shack, and my job was to recruit, train, and also manage a store. But for me, it was always recruiting time. And so I was always out looking for the next person to hire. Even if I found like that person, it's like, man, this person's going to make a great salesperson. We'd train them, get them going. But as soon as I was done with that training, I was out looking for the next one, because inevitably, especially in that field, the turnover was relatively high. But I need to always be trying to find and cultivate other people who will be effective, because you just don't know when the time's going to come where you're going to need them. And so you don't want to be left in lurches where you're without somebody to kind of help in that role.
Yes, and that's a good point. I just recently heard he's a member of the church who's a basketball coach for a university, and he gave a little talk on leadership not too long ago, and he said something like his most important job as a coach is recruiting.
Absolutely.
You know, I would have expected him to say to win games, to develop young men or whatever, but it's recruiting. And especially that's true in a college setting because those kids are only there for 4 or 5 years, and you have to, you know, revamp the team every 4 or 5 years. And so it's really pressing that you get the right people in the right positions so that the team can be successful. And, of course, you can't win unless you have the right kind of recruits, and so that's a very important thing.
I think in the church sometimes we can overlook that. You know, we get an eldership, you know, we have 2, 3, 4 guys, however many, and we're like, all right, we're good. And then it's like, okay, once one of them gets sick or dies, then we'll replace him, instead of thinking like, all right. And then the problem is, well, there's no qualified men. Instead of saying, okay, we've got some young men who are, you know, 8, 10, 12, 15 years old. Those are going to be the guys who need to be elders at some point. So working on those young men at that point, working on the 20-somethings, the 30-somethings, so that they don't do something to otherwise disqualify themselves from being able to serve as an elder. If we start putting in their minds early, you are needed for the local church. Your service, your help, your mind, your heart is needed for the local church. Then they can start to cultivate a lifestyle consistent with being an elder, a leader, so that hopefully they're in a position when it's time, when they come of age, have some life experience and maturity, fit in some of those qualifications for elders or deacons, or even if they don't fulfill that role, you can still be an effective leader within a congregation. You may not have the official capacity, but you can still be one who helps to exert influence in a godly way over, you know, a group of people within a congregation.
Yes, absolutely. And as you were speaking there, I was thinking about the qualifications of elders in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1, that there's just a handful of those qualifications that are unique to elders, you know, like the husband of one wife, faithful children, apt to teach, not a novice, things like that. I think 5 or 6 of them desire the office, but every single one of the other qualifications are qualifications that all Christians should have. You know, all Christians should be hospitable. All Christians should have good report of them who are without. You know, all Christians should be temperate, self-controlled, you know, not given to wine and all that. And so the lesson there is like, you know, especially if young men, if they can just keep themselves, as you mentioned, if they can just keep themselves pure, if they can keep themselves, you know, just Christian character until, you know, God will eventually, if they pray about it, God will eventually, if it's His will, eventually provide them a spouse. And if they just treat that spouse like they would, like God tells us to in Ephesians 5 and elsewhere, and then when children come along, just train those children up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord, as God tells us in Ephesians 6 and verse 4. And next thing you know, when they're of age to qualify as an elder, they'll be ready. Yeah. But unfortunately, many young men, they, you know, disqualify themselves early, either by, you know, bad marriages, riotous living, whatever it might be, kind of disqualify themselves so that when the time comes, there's a big void of men who are qualified. And so the lesson, I've told this to the young teenager class that I teach here on Wednesday nights, that to the guys in there, that you guys can be elders one day. God needs you, preachers, etc. Just live now for Jesus. And, you know, that brain development thing in young men, you know, when they're 25, whatever, I don't know, something like that. Yeah. So if we just keep from doing crazy things while we're young, that will be a possibility when we become of age.
I think that it might be a good idea within congregations. Maybe we could try this here at some point. I don't know. Let me know what you think. But try like a spiritual job shadowing, or not job shadowing. What do you call that?
Take your kid to work day type of thing?
No, where you do like a job, not a seminar. Anyway, where you have, you know, if you go to like say a big gymnasium and you have people that have different jobs and they talk about their jobs. What is that? That's called
job fair.
Job fair sort of thing. Yeah. What if that were a situation where there's a spiritual job fair? So you would talk. What is it like to be director of a school? Mm-hmm. What is your role? What is your role as a shepherd? So I think people may have a misconception. What does it mean to be an elder? You know, what does it mean to be a deacon, a local preacher, a preacher in your case, and a director of a school, and an instructor for the school? So, you know, all those different areas we can find men that fit those different roles, deacons, Sunday school teacher, you know, whatever it is, and have young people come and hear and listen to what those jobs look like. And so that not only do they know what it is scripturally, but they can see what it looks like practically. Because now, well, they know who Brian is. They may not know who filled that role in 1 Timothy, but they know what Brian does. And so now they can see, well, I can do what Brian does. I could fill that role one day. So maybe they can kind of get it in their minds to see what this role looks like practically. And perhaps they might be able to be encouraged, especially if they would esteem those individuals who hold the positions. And hopefully we would all be living in such a way where they could look up to us, admire us for our, service to the Lord, and hopefully want to fulfill those roles one day.
Yeah, that's a very good idea, because it's one thing to, they'll see us, just like we've often said, the first sermon that people hear is the one that we live when they see us. And so that's the same thing even with young people in the church. They may not know their Bibles well enough to know Timothy or Titus or Paul, but they see us and see how we're working. And if we can just communicate to them that we're just following Paul, we're following Jesus, we're following the example set forth in the Bible. But let's go to the book of Joshua for a moment, just to see the need of leadership and how that need can be fulfilled in the lives that we live. And I'm just going to read Joshua chapter 1, verses 1 through 9. We'll just read that real quick, and we'll make some observations from it. But in verse 1, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now therefore arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving them, the children of Israel. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given you, as I said to Moses. From the wilderness and this Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites and the great sea toward the going down of the sun shall be your territory. No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and of good courage, for to this people you shall divide as an inheritance the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and then you will have great success. Have not I commanded you? Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid or dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. And so Joshua is given this charge, and just right here, these first the first line in each of the first two verses, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord. Verse 2, Moses, my servant, is dead. And that just tells us right off the bat that current leadership cannot last forever in this world. That there's going to come a time when all of us, no matter what our age is, we're going to die, but the cause of God must continue. And so there's always going to be the need for leadership in this side of life.
Joshua is probably one of the most fascinating leaders to me in the scriptures because, okay, Moses is one of the just most magnificent people in the scripture, period. He's at the top of the list for even various religious groups in the world, So, okay, you have this guy like Moses who is just, top tier leader, right? But then you have Joshua who's supposed to come after this, the greatest leader in his up to this time, likely, And so then here's Joshua having to come after him. But one of the most fascinating things to me about Joshua's leadership starts in Numbers, right? Mm-hmm. So Joshua, there's two words in the book of Numbers that are used to describe various leaders. And they're two unique words, if I remember correctly. So in Numbers 13, he says, of every tribe of their fathers, this is verse 1 or verse 2, of every tribe of their fathers shall you send a man, everyone a ruler among them. Then in verse 3, he says, and Moses, by the commandment of the Lord, sent them from the wilderness of Paran. All those men were heads of the children of Israel. So you have two different words. If I remember correctly, they're two unique Hebrew words for leaders. Okay, so you have these two men, or you have these group of men, two of which are Caleb, verse 6, and Joshua, verse number 8. All right, so then the children of Israel are going to go spy out the land. So Caleb in chapter 13:30 is like, hey, look, man, let's go up at once and possess this land. Of course, you know, the people, they don't want to hear it. And then Joshua gives a crack at it in chapter 14, verse 6, Joshua, the son of Nun. He comes and tells the people, look, let's go and do it. You know, if the Lord delights in us, he'll bring us into this land. You know, it flows with milk and honey, but just don't rebel against Jehovah. And then all the congregation, verse 10, they bade to stone him with stones. And the glory of the Lord appeared into the tabernacle of the congregation before all the children of Israel. So Joshua has a position in Numbers. He is an actual leader position.
Yeah.
But he has no influence, it seems, over the people. For various reasons. I think there's a couple different reasons. But then you turn to the book of Joshua, and you have this amazing first pronouncement in chapter 1 you just read. And then when the book closes, Joshua's like, hey, guys, you do what you want to do, but here's what godliness looks like. We're going to follow the Lord. And unanimously, I think 3 or 4 times in chapter 24, it says, the people say, amen, we're going to follow God. And so one of the things to me is, what do you think happened in the mind of the people, perhaps, between the Numbers and between Joshua that took him from a leader in role to a leader in practice and to be followed with influence in the book of Joshua?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, but I think the answer is people saw what he accomplished, saw his leadership. Of course, God says he's with him. And as we read in chapter 1, as I said to Moses, he says in verse 3, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave you nor forsake you. And so, which goes to the point that, you know, people, when they see a leader, you know, that's what connects with them, you know, because like right. We can talk about it, we can have it on paper, but actually seeing it happen gives it more credibility.
Right,
you know?
right.
And I also thought about, you know, as you were talking, I was thinking like, wow, you know, because usually in our culture, if you have a big-time preacher that's been in a congregation for a long time, and the second guy that follows him, he's usually out the door within a year.
That's it.
But Joshua wasn't like that.
No.
Because he just took up the mantle, and it may have been because of the ending of Moses' life. You know, he wasn't allowed to go into the promised land. He died before they went in there. Of course, God showed him everything and all that. Mm-hmm. And so it may have been they just saw Joshua as a continuation of Moses' leadership. But clearly it says, you know, Moses is dead. Now, therefore, arise and go. And so, you know, that's part of it, at least that they see that. And, of course.
Yeah, so in Deuteronomy, the end of Deuteronomy, you know, of course, like chapter 34 is like one of the most awesome but sad chapters to me, at least. You know, this great leader, Moses, is not going to be able to go into the promised land. But in verse 9, 34:9, it says, and Joshua the son of Nun was full of the spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him. And the children of Israel hearkened unto him and did as the Lord commanded Moses. And so part of it is, I think, like you mentioned, okay, they get to see Joshua as a leader, like some action that he did. And you see most of it, obviously, in the book of Joshua, some of the exploits and things of that nature. But also part of the leadership of Joshua and what made him such a great leader is because Moses was such a great leader. Mm-hmm. And part of being a good leader is what we just talked about with the elders, always be looking to recruit. And just imagine if Moses was like, no, I'm not going to lay my hands on him. Listen, I'm Moses, man. I stood before Pharaoh. I'm the one that had the staff to open up the Red Sea. I'm Moses. And then where would Joshua be?
Right.
You know, he could have been, like you mentioned about the preacher, you know, he could have been out the door, at least in the people's eyesight.
Yeah. And that's a good point, that Joshua had the endorsement, the full public endorsement. And that's what laying on of hands right here is referring to. Mm-hmm. Full public endorsement of Moses. Mm-hmm. And so, and unlike some of the second preachers after the big-time preacher leaves, they may not have that endorsement.
Sure.
And, of course, there's the people's aspect of it, too, which right. You know, you do have with the spies and all that. But, I mean, it was just a great leader, tremendous leader. Now, of course, Joshua, you know, he was being prepared for this from the get-go, it seems. We read about him in Exodus chapter 24:13. As well as in chapter 32 and chapter 33, as a close co-worker with Moses, which I think is good to point out. Moses as the leader, takes men under his wing, as it were, to help train them, to help, lift them up in some things. I'm looking at Exodus 24, verse 13. Exodus 24, verse 13. So Moses arose with his assistant Joshua, and Moses went up to the mountain of God. And this is, of course, at Sinai and all that. Then also we read about him in chapter 32, verse 15, chapter 32 and verse 15 of Exodus. And there, of course, is, when he's coming down from the mountain, as it were. But Moses turned and went down from the mountain, and the 2 tablets and the testimony of that, 32, 15 through 17, 16. Now the tablets were the working, but verse 17, and when Joshua heard the noise of the people, as they shouted, he said to Moses, there's a noise of war in the camp. And so it seems like Joshua actually was with him during that time he went up to the mountain. And then in chapter 33, verse 11, the Lord spoke to Moses face to face as a man speaks to his friend, and he would return to the camp, but his servant Joshua, the son of Nun, a young man, did not depart from the tabernacle. And so, Joshua was with Moses throughout all that. And then I would just put the pieces together in Numbers. He's a leader of the tribe or the families, and he is chosen as one of the spies.
Yeah, so I guess there's a multiple layer. So you have Moses takes him under his wing. You see that in the book of Exodus. So he's watching leadership. Then he has a role in Numbers to go out and spout the land.
Yes.
But then he gets to put that into practice. He gets Moses' endorsement, and greater still in Joshua chapter 1, which you read, he gets Jehovah's endorsement. And so all those things kind of factor together, caused this the people to really kind of cling to him and observe his leadership, which I guess would be the ideal scenario, even for, today Jehovah's not going to, say, Brian, Kenyon or anything like that. But we do get his endorsement, so to speak, when we are doing what thus says the Lord. And so when individuals can see, okay, he's got God's endorsement, so to speak, by doing what God has said, they may see courage and valor in standing up against that which is incorrect. They see that you're able to lead as well as be led, like Joshua was. As those are some of the things that would make Joshua as effective in that role.
Yes, very good. And I like what you said there about, maybe that we see a progression here of preparing a leader. First you choose somebody, and then you kind of mentor him, if you will, take him under your wing. Then you give him just a little bit of responsibility here and there. Maybe let him make mistakes, because that's how we're going to grow and learn.
Absolutely.
And then once he has a little bit of responsibility, he that's faithful in a little will be faithful in much. And then you can give him a greater responsibility as, being a spy. And then if he passes that test, and passes that test in the eyes of God, not in the people, but in the eyes of God.
Right.
And then next thing you know, he's leading the nation. And, of course, he did, if you go throughout the book of Judges, even though he left some spots open, he did accomplish the task. In Joshua 24:13, God says, I've given you a land for which you did not labor, and cities which you did not build, and you dwell in them, and you eat of the vineyards and the olive groves which you did not plant. And then he also mentions there that, that all his promise in chapter 23 and verse 15, and therefore it shall come to pass that as all the good things have come upon you, which the Lord your God promised you, so the Lord will bring upon you all the harmful things until he has destroyed from you this good land which the Lord your God has given you. And so he has not failed.
I think 14 is what you're looking for.
Yeah. All have come to pass, not one word of them has failed.
Yeah, God gave them everything.
Everything that he promised, he gave to them, which is, one of the reasons why it was such an unfaithful act to not take the land, because even if you go back in Numbers chapter 13, when he first sent the spies out, Numbers 13, he says in verse 2, send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel, from each tribe of their fathers, etc., but which I am given to the children of Israel. In other words, God is giving it to you. How dare you say we can't take it?
Exactly.
If God has promised it and it's yours, go get it, to back off. And so when we go to Joshua chapter 1, after the death of Moses, well, verse 2, Moses, my servant, is dead. Arise, go over this Jordan, you and all this people, to the land which I am giving them, the children of Israel. And so in both places, God says, I'm giving it to you. But in the spies, they didn't think they could take it. Of course, Joshua and Caleb said they could. But here, the nation, and again, the leadership of Joshua, the nation is going to follow his lead, and they will take the land, even though they did leave some pockets. It'll come back to haunt them later. But at the end of Joshua, those passages do talk about that the land promise was fulfilled.
Absolutely. Which, I like the point that you raised in that if we fail, in their case, to take the land, that is disobeying, but it's also not trusting God. God says, listen, this is yours. All you need to do is go over. And the other part is not only did he say, hey, go over there. He didn't say go over. I don't know what it's going to be like though when you get there. He said, I'm going to drive the people out. You just need to go over and do your part. I'll do mine. You got to do your part. Which, for application's sake today, there are things that we have to do that are challenging, but we still don't get to shirk the responsibility and say, well, God, is going to be so tough, so we can't do it. Whether it relates to being being holy, I can't be holy. I can't be perfect. It's like, no, you can be holy. He told us to be holy. Whether it be, evangelizing, go out to all the world. Well, I can't do that. There's so many people out there. So terrible. Well, he knows that, but we still have the same responsibility as individual leaders, but also as collective leaders. I mean, I think the church should be at the forefront of leadership in the world, demonstrating and influencing and demonstrating what it means to be a believer in Christ and what it looks like to model Jesus' actions. Yeah,
that's a very good point. And when we think about this, and I want to get this in real quick, we've got about 5 or 10 minutes left here, but Joshua exemplifies good leadership here. And I'm going to mention 4 points here that we see from this text, Joshua chapter 1, that's not just for elders, but this is for any person in the church who wants to have the influence for Christ over others and the motivation to help them to work and to do God's will. And so, number 1, Joshua was not a procrastinator. Now, I know some of us, priorities, there are some things that take priority over others. And but notice, Moses, my servant, is dead. Verse 2, now, therefore, arise, go over this Jordan. Now, there was a mourning period for Moses' death, but after that was over, now's the time to go. And so Joshua, he did act upon that. In verse 10, after the context we read in Joshua 1, then Joshua commanded the officers of the people, saying, and so he starts mobilizing everything after that mourning period, and he gets to action. And of course, Proverbs 27:1, we know not what a day may bring. Matthew 6:33 or 34, sufficient to the day is the evil thereof, but act upon it now. Behold, today is the day of salvation. 2 Corinthians 6 verse 2, etc. But do not procrastinate. And again, sometimes priorities take precedence, and so from the outside, it may look like we're procrastinating on some things, but some things have to be done sometimes. And so, but God knows. And so we need to get to work.
And waiting is not procrastinating either. Right. There are times that God told the people of Israel, across the Jordan time, hey, look, you stand still, you be still. This is my time to work. So there are times that it is important to exercise patience,
Yes.
But that is when we are waiting on the Lord, or perhaps waiting on his timing, not just saying, well, I'm going to drag my feet here at this point. So waiting and procrastinating are very different. But I like that, that God gives a command. It's like, all right, there has to be some urgency with the leadership, not just, man, I got my manager, name tag, and so I'm good. I'm fine now. It's like, no, now it's time to get to work. Put that name tag as a word to work. And so Joshua, like you just mentioned, he got directly to it. So as soon as he gets that encouragement, verses 1 through 9, the very next verse, Joshua commanded the officers of the people. So as soon as he gets instruction, all right, here it is. Here's what we got to do.
He's gone. And that's the Lord's time right there. All right, and then secondly, leaders are going to have to overcome obstacles, learn to overcome obstacles. Of course, they had a whole land of Canaan to go into, but verses 3 through 5, every place that your sole of your foot will tread upon, as I have given you, as I said to Moses. And he lists the boundaries from the wilderness of this Lebanon to the great river Euphrates, from the land of the Hittites to the going down of the sea toward the going down of the sun, the great sea toward the going down of the sun. But he promises, no man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not leave or forsake you. And you think about, that group that Joshua was a part of, they saw the plagues in Egypt. They came out, they saw the dividing of the Red Sea, they saw the sea collapsing again to engulf the Egyptians, and so they saw the great power of God firsthand. And so again, shame on them for not believing the two spies way back in Numbers, but God will help us to overcome the obstacles, and they're all over the place.
And it's also a matter of perspective. Are these obstacles or are they opportunities? Right. I'm thinking about Jesus in Samaria. To some, that would have been an obstacle. But for Jesus, he's like, hey, look, the fields are white to harvest. This is an opportunity. And so with the children of Israel, like in Numbers we just referenced, looking at these people who, are giants in the walled cities. And they even said the land will swallow us up.
Oh, yeah.
This is an opportunity for us to do what God said. Not only so, but to be blessed by God. So it's not just an opportunity to obey, but it's an opportunity to obey and then therefore be blessed.
Yeah, and also to show that the God of Israel is the true God.
Is the true God.
You think about David and Goliath. You think about all the, when the odds are against you, but yet still God gives us the victory, and that speaks volumes.
And that was kind of a hallmark to Joshua's leadership. And I'm just thinking about the walls of Jericho. Those walls can never come down. There's no way in the world. I mean, you can have chariots riding side by side. Nobody can bring down those walls. It's like, well, our job is to look at this as an opportunity. Go around, circle around, blow the horns, do what God said. He'll do his part. Yeah,
and then word of that went all the way through the land. But good
Absolutely.
Stuff. And then, so do not procrastinate, overcome obstacles, and see them as opportunities. And then thirdly, be courageous. And of course, that's a key word throughout this whole context. Beginning with verse 6, be strong and of good courage. Verse 7, be strong and very courageous. Verse 9, be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid or dismayed. And sometimes, we can have that spirit of fear that Paul told Timothy God did not give us, but sometimes that can keep us from great things in leadership if we have the fear.
That's right. I wonder, just kind of real quickly as an aside, I wonder why the repetition here to Joshua. And the reason I say that is because Joshua doesn't demonstrate fear. He was one of the ones who said, man, look, let's go in there and take the land. They're bread for us. Let's go. But I wonder if it was maybe an instruction to him on behalf of the people, go and be courageous even in front of them. Not necessarily just the enemy. I guess it would take courage on both sides.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it's kind of like it's also doing a double thing. In that case would be, he's directing it to Joshua, but everyone else is hearing it. And so it shows the importance of a leader, demonstrating what God is telling him, and that gets everybody on board with it when they see that and they see the leader going forward.
Right.
But when the leader shirks, and think about when King Saul was king.
That's just what I was thinking about.
And Goliath is around there, threatening the children of Israel. Well, King Saul wasn't very courageous to begin with. Remember, he was hiding behind the baggage when he was, God was choosing him to be a king. And so the way that leadership, as the leadership goes so the people, and so that leadership of King Saul was not what it ought to be. And then so the people weren't what they ought to be.
Man, enter all the kings of Israel and Judah.
That's right. Yeah, that's right. And then, but Joshua comes along, and he can be courageous, and he instills that courage in the people. Mm-hmm. And then finally, observing God's law. We cannot be a good leader unless we observe God's law, which, of course, he says there in verse 7, that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it to the right hand or to the left, that you may prosper And then verse 8 in the middle there, do not depart, or the book of this law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate in it day and night, that you may observe to do according to all that is written in it. And then I'll make your way prosperous. And so God will bless us when we have these four things as leaders. Do not procrastinate, overcome the obstacles, turning them into opportunities, being courageous, and observing God's law.
I just noticed this. I don't guess I've ever noticed it before. In verses 7 and 8, he says something prior to the word. So verse 7, he says, be strong and courageous, that you may observe to do according to the law. In verse 8, the book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night, that you may observe. So in both cases, one, you need to be brave in obeying God's word, because there's going to be things that discourage you, throw you off track. But you also have to know the word in order to do the word. So both of those kind of working in concert demonstrate aspects of a leader. You do need to be brave, absolutely, but you also need to know what God says.
Yes.
And that is the hallmark of a true biblical leader, not just, you're strong and tough, those sorts of things. I think those are necessary components of leadership as I think are borne out in all the scriptures, even with Jesus. Mm-hmm. But what is bravery if it's not harnessed or bridled? I'll use the term bridled by holiness or righteousness or godliness.
Mm-hmm. Correct. And I think that's a good observation, because people can know what God says, but they don't observe it.
Right.
But if they know what God says, and one reason why they don't observe it is because they don't have the courage to observe it, either because of what others may think or because of their own doubt, like the 10 spies. Mm-hmm. But if God says he's given us this land to go in and take it, we can have the courage because we're going to rely upon God to see us through, because he's the one that told us to go do it anyway. Right. And so the two things go hand in hand.
Yeah, that's some great stuff with Joshua. I just you had those three, and I know we're probably running right out of time, but just with the last couple of seconds, I referenced it earlier, but I love the close of Joshua. Yes. There's verses 16, 21, 24, and 31, and with each of these, you find all the people answering, and there's kind of like this back and forth with Joshua and the people. Look, do what you want to do, but we're going to serve God. The people say in verse 17, they answer, God forbid that we should forsake the Lord to serve other gods. And then you have a similar thing. Joshua is giving some instruction in verse 21. The people said to Joshua, no, we're going to serve the Lord. Again, in verse 24, the people said to Joshua, the Lord our God, we will serve, and his voice will we obey. And then 31 is kind of the culmination of it. Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that overlived Joshua, and which had known all the works of the Lord, and in which he had done for Israel. So Joshua's leadership was so impactful that the people followed him every day of his life, and even the lives of the elders that extended beyond him, which shows that his leadership was not only in himself, but with the elders also, which brought them some influence with the people, like Moses, with Joshua. And that generation of people lived faithfully for the Lord, which is just so awesome to me. That those people, you go from numbers, we're not going to do whatever you're talking about, Joshua, but then here, Joshua, we're going to follow Jehovah. Not just we're going to follow you, Joshua, but we're going to follow Jehovah because you have been such an impactful leader in our lives.
Yeah. And then when you get to the book of Judges, there was that generation that did not know. Yeah. But Joshua did his part, and that shows the need. So that generation that outlived Joshua, maybe they didn't do their part so well.
That next set of elders.
They were just living off of the laurels of what Joshua did, and then that third, which shows the need that we have to have people ready. We have to train people, get them ready for the time it is for them to step up.
And that can be easy to do, though, to do like those elders. I think we can look at them, at least I have in times past, and think like, man, these terrible guys, in Judges chapter 2, there's this generation of people that don't know God. How could that happen? They didn't teach, they didn't learn, whatever. But then if you have a certain style of leadership that works, is impactful for a number of years or decades or generations, whatever, when it's time to replace it, that's hard to do. Because what if a leader's not that guy? Because Joshua was in no way a leader just like Moses.
Right.
Totally different leaders.
To begin with, yeah.
Yeah, so when you think about that, well, how do you replace a guy like Moses? And then how do you replace a guy like Joshua? And it's like, well, you just got to replace him.
Mm-hmm.
You'll be different,
Yeah.
but you still got to replace him.
Yeah, you train them in the principles of the Bible and
That's
let their
right.
own personalities come out. Let those principles affect their personalities and their style of leadership and all that, and then carry it out. But those points, don't procrastinate.
Yeah.
Overcome obstacles. Be courageous. Observe God's law.
That's it.
I mean, you get those in your heart, you can be a Moses, you can be a Joshua.
That's it.
You can be a Deborah, you can be whoever. Great leadership. Well, we appreciate your being with us and what I'm calling a Bumper-Sowed here, a episode between our first and second season. Usually Forrest Anamasaris is with us, but he was not able to make it today. But we appreciate your being here, and we'd invite you to tune in for our second Bumper-Sowed next week. And until then, we hope you have a great, beautiful day.
On Mount Calvary, cruel Calvary, paved the way by blood that we might win a bright shining crown.